in the process of, we started here a couple weeks ago, that we talked about there are two different plans for these end of days, two different plans for all of eternity. The plan of the fallen spirits, we often think of that as the serpent or Satan, and the plan of God. Now, as we continue to progress on that, I'm going to start by reading the first chapter of the Screw Tape Letters. And how many of you have ever read the Screw Tape Letters?
Parts of it.
Okay, good. So the chapters are really short, but they are intensely full. So as I read them, what we want to do is we want to note some things that as I read it. And what are those notes that we want to know is, what is the method that Screw Tape, in the Screw Tape Letters, what is the method that the serpent uses to prevent us from walking the narrow path? And the whole book is the spiritual warfare, how to prevent mankind from walking the narrow path, walking with God. And so we want to look at what he says. What is the method the enemy uses to pull us off that path? The other thing we want to know is, how do we defend against it? And then the third thing, how do we go on the offense in it? Okay, so we're going to start there, and but before we do, I want to read two passages. And these passages will help us understand, they're not going to help us understand. So, actually, can you guys see it? Okay, I've got the Screw Tape Letter up there. And you can follow along as I read it. But first, I want us to look at Isaiah 65, verse 12. And it's up here. And the prophet Isaiah writes in Isaiah 65:12, I will destine you to the sword, and all of you shall bow down to the slaughter. Because when I called, you did not answer. When I spoke, you did not listen. Now here, God is talking to the nation, his people called, chosen out. So he's saying, because I called you and you did not answer, did not respond. Remember what was Paul said in Romans 1, what were the two things that we had to do? And he said it in the negative. Because they do not acknowledge God and give him thanks. Here we see that acknowledging God. God called and they did not answer. So that's the same thing. Paul is just quoting or the understanding of Isaiah. Because when I called, you did not answer. When I spoke, you did not listen. So they didn't have ears to ear. And then he goes on. Instead, you did what was evil in my eyes and chose what I did not delight in. So here we see that the nation of Israel had a role in their salvation. They did not answer God. They did not acknowledge him. And when God spoke, they didn't listen, pay attention. They did what their own desires were to do, and they chose to do what God did not delight them to do. Therefore, thus says the Lord God, behold, my servant shall eat, but you shall be hungry. Behold, my servant shall drink, but you shall be thirsty. Behold, my servant shall rejoice, but you shall be put to shame. Behold, my servants will sing for gladness of heart, but you shall cry out for pain of heart, and shall wait for breaking of spirit. And it is that breaking of a spirit we're going to talk a little bit more tonight. The next passage that I want to read is Matthew 7, 13 to 14. And this is Jesus speaking. Hi, Georgia. Come on in. Somebody make her a seat. Yeah, Jean's got it.
Oh, there's a chair next to Gene, so.
Matthew 7, verses 12. We're going to start with Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14 is what we're going to look at.
Is this NIV or?
This is ESV.
Extra special version?
Extra special version.
My work here is done.
Your work is done. We do not use the nearly inspired version.
But sometimes I will.
Nearly
As do I.
NIV, yeah. Okay, so you can thank James for that. So we're just, George, it's good to see you. We're just continuing our study on our
Romans
warfare
13.
during these days. We're working on what does God want us to do in these end of days, since we're all pretty well convinced that it's the end of days, that God has a plan, and that Satan has a plan, and God has a plan, and we're continuing our study on how we are part of that plan and what we do. So reading Jesus' words in Matthew 7, starting at 13. And here he says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." So as we keep those two scriptures in mind, I'm going to start by reading C.S. Lewis's book, first chapter. Now, of these characters, we have, let's see if I've lost it. I want to be able to bring your attention to who the characters are, in case you don't know. And Andrew Dean Swafford wrote a book called Spiritual Survival of the Modern World, Insights of the C.S. Lewis Screwtape Letters. And I'm going to use a small content of his, and I'm going to just read it, and a little bit about him, and why, for his words, explain why I wanted to start this study. I've been a professor of theology for 10 years now at Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas, and for the past several years, I've taught a class called Christian Moral Life. When I first taught it, almost on a whim, I decided to add C.S. Lewis. From the very beginning, I was struck by how so many of my students responded to Lewis, students from all different backgrounds. Their experience over several years with so many different kinds of students has led to the writing of this book. Now for his introductory. Now for an introductory sense of what this book is about, Screwtape Letters are 31 fictional letters written by a demon named Screwtape. Now, we are going to do some theological checking. Demons are not in heaven. And though C.S. Lewis will use the word demons to demonstrate those spiritual beings that were fallen, and we are told in Revelation, does anybody know how many demons? Revelation 12, that the serpent was cast out of heaven and took a third of his angels with him, the angelic beings. So C.S. Lewis made the interpretation at that time, with the knowledge he had, that they were all demons. But with the knowledge we have today, by the books of Jubilees, Enoch, and a few others, we can see that demons, what Jesus cast out of people, are only here on the earth. And what those demons are the spirits that have been released from the Nephilim. Those who were born from the sons of God, the spiritual being, and the women. And Enoch tells us how that works out. Yes, Tim.
You answered it.
Okay, so if you want to know more about that, I would encourage you to check out Enoch, and I have copies of it if you want that. So a demon,
Where do we get Enoch? The book Enoch.
Are you talking about Enoch or speaking?
Enoch, the book of Enoch. I've got it in, I think I got it in a hardcover, and I got it in digital version. Now I got it in English and in
Good, because I speak
Greek.
Aramaic.
Okay, so when he says demon, he's imagining the spiritual entities that rebelled with Satan. Though in real life, demons are the spirits of the Nephilim, which incorporate any living creature they can get their way into. And that's what Jesus cast out. So
they are no longer God's creation. Right?
Yeah. These letters are addressed to Screwtape's nephew, Wormwood. So these are both spiritual beings. They'll be called demons from henceforth. The content of these letters are Screwtape's advice, who is a senior demon, a senior spiritual entity, to Wormwood, a junior spiritual entity, on how to seduce the human being over whom Wormwood has demonic charge. In other words, Wormwood is the demonic equivalent of a guardian angel and has been assigned to a particular human being, a man in our case also referred to as Wormwood's patient. So we have three main characters: Screwtape, the lead demon, uncle demon, and author of the letters; Wormwood, the nephew demon and recipient of the letters; and the patient, the man whom Wormwood is trying to seduce and bring to hell, and to just by keeping him off the narrow path. C.S. Lewis doesn't talk too much about the narrow path, but you'll see the correlation. Throughout the book, Screwtape also refers to the enemy, by which he means God. So that is the beginning of the book, and I will start by reading it to you in chapter 1. And look for the method that is proposed to keep the client, to keep the patient off of God's narrow path. I know what you say about guiding our patient's reading and taking care that he sees a good deal of his materialist friend. But are you not being a trifle knave? It sounds as if you suppose that argument was the way to keep him out of the enemy's clutches. That might have been so if he had lived a few centuries earlier. At that time, the humans still knew pretty well when a thing was proved and when it was not. And if it was proved, they really believed it. They still connected thinking with doing and were prepared to alter their way of life as the result of a chain of reasoning. But what with the weekly press and other such weapons, we have largely altered that. Your man has been accustomed, ever since he was a boy, to have a dozen incompatible philosophies dancing about together inside his head. He doesn't think of doctrines as primarily true or false, but as academic or practical, outworn or contemporary, conventional or ruthless. Jargon, not argument, is your best ally in keeping him from the church. Don't waste time trying to make him think that materialism is true. Make him think it is strong or stark or courageous. That is the philosophy of the future. That's the sort of thing he cares about. The trouble about argument is that it moves the whole struggle into the enemy's own ground. He can argue too, whereas in really practical propaganda, of the kind I am suggesting, he has been shown for centuries to be greatly inferior of our Father below. By the very act of arguing, you awake the patient's reason. And once it is awake, who can foresee the result? Even if a particular train of thought can be twisted so as to end in our favor, you will find that you have been strengthening in your patient the fatal habit of attending to universal issues and withdrawing his attention from the stream of immediate sense experiences. Your business is to fix his attention on the stream. Teach him to call it real life, and don't let him ask what he means by real. Remember, he is not like you, a pure spirit. Never having been a human, oh, that abominable advantage of the enemies, you don't realize how enslaved they are to the pressure of the ordinary. I once had a patient, a sound atheist, who used to read in the British Museum. One day, as he sat reading, I saw a train of thought in his mind beginning to go the wrong way. The enemy, of course, was at his elbow in a minute. Before I knew where I was, I saw my 20 years of work beginning to totter. If I had lost my head and begun to attempt a defense by argument, I should have been undone. But I was not such a fool. I struck instantly at the part of the man which I had best under my control, and suggested that it was just about time he had some lunch. At least I think that must have been his... Whoops, did I lose my spot? The enemy presumably made the counter suggestion. You know how one can never quite overhear what he says to them, that this was more important than lunch. At least I think that must have been his line, for when I said quite, in fact, much too important to tackle it the end of a morning, the patient brightened up considerably, and by the time I had added, much better come back after lunch and go into it with a fresh mind, he was already halfway to the door. Once he was in the street, the battle was won. I showed him a newsboy shouting the midday paper and a number 73 bus going past. And before he reached the bottom of the steps, I had got into him an unalterable conviction that whatever odd ideas that might come into a man's head when he was shut up alone with his books, a healthy dose of real life, by which he meant the bus and the newsboy, was enough to show him that all that sort of thing just couldn't be true. He knew he'd had a narrow escape, and in later years was fond of talking about that inarticulate sense for actuality, which is our ultimate safeguard against the aberrations of mere logic. He is now safe in our Father's house. You begin to see the point? Thanks to processes which we set at work in them centuries ago, they find it all but impossible to believe in unfamiliar, while the familiar is before their eyes. Keep pressing home on him the ordinariness of things. Above all, do not attempt to use science. I mean, of course, the real science as a defense against Christianity. They will positively encourage him to think about realities he can't touch and see. There have been sad cases among the modern physicists. If he must dabble in science, keep him on economics and sociology. Don't let him get away from that invaluable real life. But the best of all is to let him read no science, but to give him a grand general idea that he knows it all, and that everything he happens to have picked up in casual talk and reading is the result of modern investigation. Do remember, you are there to fuddle him. From the way some of you young fiends talk, anyone would suppose it was your job to teach. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. Okay, so what did you hear? What was Screwtape telling Wormwood that would keep his patient out of the church?
Keep them arguing and confused and questioning and being at odds with each other, to be seen and true.
Okay.
Not,
Yeah.
Not being Berean-ish.
Not being rich, not seeking truth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Distractions.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Distractions.
Distraction.
Checking his facts.
What was the distraction?
Everything.
Yeah.
It was mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what is everything? What was the distraction specifically he was trying to show him?
Stuff.
Science?
Just being alive, it's worth everything.
Yeah, just life. Life is truth, right? Whatever we see. We call that today relative truth. That if we walk, and whatever I see or do or I think, that is relatively true. So what he didn't want him to do was what?
Investigate.
Right.
Unknown.
Investigate what?
Truth.
Truth. Very good. Truth. James.
A couple people, and as I think about it, I think that this is the earliest use of the idea. Have attributed this to Oprah Winfrey back in the 80s, 90s. And that's the phrase, my truth. My truth is whatever.
Yeah.
And your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. Rather than truth being an actual objective reality, that truth is subjective to the whims of the person who believes it.
Yeah.
And that's a step beyond the actual reality, which is that truth is truth, whether we like it or not. And we can choose to reject it, but I mean, I reject the reality of gravity, and then I step off a large building and I find out that my rejection doesn't count.
It doesn't apply.
It does not apply.
Deb.
When I was going to the training for Big Sisters, I think it was called, they had us read a book called I'm Okay, You're Okay. And that was one of my first realizations that we're not okay. I was like, what am I supposed to do here? But I don't know if you guys remember that book.
I remember that book.
It's,
Yeah.
I find it extremely strange in a politically correct world that we can't even continue to use the true definitions of words.
Yeah.
Because we're in a world that caters to emotionalism and sensuality and no longer wants to deaden those things to find truth.
Yeah, and you'll notice that,
Truth.
and that's what he said about senses. Let him think of his senses as being true.
Right.
But his senses being true. Okay, so how do we fight against this?
Truth. I think we could love the truth.
We could love the truth. So to fight against it, we seek truth, knowing that the enemy is going to attempt not to keep us from going there. So does the go ahead, James.
Well, and the other subtle thing in the argument or in the advice given by Screwtape is to not have a face-to-face argument. Don't get people pulling out their facts. Just distract him. Just distract him and suggest to him that how he feels is fine, and it's all okay. And it's the Peter Pan reality. Everything will pan out or peter out, and don't worry about it. It just is, and you're fine. Just move on with your life. It's the first way that the enemy comes against us and against anybody is I'm not here.
Yeah. And God is not either.
And God is not either.
Yeah. Tim.
I find it, hopefully I can say this, but I find it interesting, when this was written by C.S. Lewis, that during those times that he recognized, and actually in science world, it was led, most of it, by believers. But to see how valuable science is in testifying to the truth.
Yeah.
And to God.
True science.
And that's what the world will do everything they can do to blur. They don't, they want to change. You go try to talk about the actual truth. It's like talking about abortion or anything. You try to get to the truth, and it becomes this mysterious thing that's not really figured out. I mean, that's pretty true for you, but that's not what I believe. And I find it interesting how that it's today. It's a major issue, and when he was writing this, it was a major issue.
Let's also remember this. He wrote this book, and it was published in 1941.
So a long time before I was born.
80 years ago. But you can see they were experiencing the same assault against truth and sciences at that time, and we've developed a lot further into that line.
Liar has not stopped lying.
So we mentioned that the way we combat that is truth, or seeking of truth. But that's easy for us. But how many of us have been pulled off the path by a distraction? You hear the Lord talking to you in your mind, and you say, oh, yeah, okay, and you start maybe a conversation and do something, but then Satan introduces, hey, it's lunchtime. Oh, yeah, I should go to lunch.
Every time you can.
See, now, this is a very popular method that Satan uses.